The Seat by the Window. Chapter 1. Morning in the Bus. The morning in Lyon began with soft light spreading across the streets, touching the rooftops and waking the city slowly. The air carried the smell of fresh bread from the bakeries and the sound of footsteps mixed with the hum of traffic. The city bus arrived at the stop with its usual rhythm, opening its doors to passengers who stepped inside, each carrying their own thoughts, worries, and hopes. The bus was ordinary, with worn seats and windows that showed the world outside, but for those who entered that morning it became something more. Each passenger chose a seat by the window, unaware that what they would see during this ride would change the way they looked at life. Jean-Paul Durand, a man of 45, sat near the middle of the bus. He was an accountant, a man who lived by numbers and schedules. His life had become a routine of office work, bills, and quiet evenings. He carried the weight of fatigue in his shoulders, and his eyes showed the emptiness of someone who had forgotten how to dream. He chose the window seat not for curiosity but for habit, a place where he could avoid conversation and watch the city pass by. Yet behind his tired expression there was a quiet longing, a hidden desire to feel something different, something that could remind him that life was more than balance sheets and deadlines. Clara Weber entered next, a woman of 32, carrying a sketchbook under her arm. She was a German artist who had come to Lyon searching for inspiration. Her eyes moved quickly, noticing colors, shapes, and details that others ignored. She chose a seat by the window because she wanted to see the city as it lived, to capture moments that could later become part of her art. Clara was restless, always searching for meaning in the ordinary, but she often doubted herself. She wondered if her work had value, if her vision was strong enough to speak to others. The window became her canvas, a frame through which she hoped to find the spark she needed. Marcos Silva, a young student of 24, stepped onto the bus with hesitation. He was from Portugal, living in Lyon to study economics, but his heart was uncertain. He questioned his choices, wondering if the path he had chosen was truly his own or simply the expectation of others. He carried books in his bag but doubts in his mind. He chose a window seat because he wanted space to think, to look outside and imagine possibilities beyond the classroom. His youth gave him energy, but his uncertainty made him restless. He hoped that one day he would find clarity, a direction that felt true to himself. Finally, Louise Benoit, a widow of 67, entered the bus slowly. Her steps were careful, her hands holding a small bag. She had lived in Lyon all her life, but since the death of her husband she had felt the city grow colder. She carried loneliness with her, a silence that followed her everywhere. She chose a seat by the window because it gave her comfort, a way to connect with the world outside even when she felt apart from it. Louise searched for meaning in small things, in gestures and memories, hoping to find strength to continue. Her eyes carried sadness, but also a quiet resilience, the kind that grows from years of living and losing. The bus moved forward, carrying these 4 passengers together though they did not yet know each other. Each looked through the window, expecting only the usual view of streets and people. But the morning held something different. The city outside was alive with scenes that reflected their own struggles and hopes. They did not realize that the ride would become a journey, not only through Lyon but through themselves. The seats by the window were more than places to sit. They were mirrors, showing each passenger the lessons they needed to see. The morning in the bus began as ordinary, but it carried the promise of change, a quiet reminder that sometimes the smallest journeys can open the largest doors. Chapter 2. Jean-Paul's view. Jean-Paul Durand sat in the middle of the bus, his body heavy with the weight of years spent in routine. He had worked as an accountant for most of his adult life, and his days had become a cycle of numbers, reports, and deadlines. He was respected for his discipline and reliability, but inside he felt empty. His life had grown cold, shaped by rules and calculations, and he had forgotten what it meant to feel joy in simple things. He looked out of the window without expectation, thinking only that the ride would pass as usual. Yet that morning carried something different, something that would touch him in a way he had not felt for years. As the bus moved through the streets of Lyon, Jean-Paul's eyes fell on a man sitting near a wall. The man was clearly homeless, his clothes worn and his face marked by hardship. Beside him sat a small dog, thin but loyal, watching him with trust. Jean-Paul saw the man break a piece of bread and place it gently in front of the dog before taking a smaller piece for himself. The gesture was simple, but it carried a deep meaning. The man had little, yet he chose to share. His generosity existed even in poverty, and it was given without hesitation. Jean-Paul felt a sudden ache in his chest, a realization that unsettled him. He thought about his own life, about the way he had guarded his possessions and his time. He had always believed that security came from saving, from protecting himself against risk. He had built walls around his heart, convincing himself that kindness was a luxury he could not afford. Yet here was a man with nothing, offering what little he had to a creature that depended on him. Jean-Paul understood that generosity was not about wealth. It was about spirit, about the willingness to give even when life was hard. He began to doubt the cold way of living he had chosen, the path that had kept him safe but had also kept him distant from others. The bus continued forward, but Jean-Paul's thoughts stayed with the man and the dog. He remembered moments from his past when he had once been more open, when he had laughed with friends and shared meals without counting the cost. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that part of himself. He had allowed fear and responsibility to close his heart, turning him into a man who measured everything but felt little. The sight through the window reminded him that life was not only about numbers. It was about connection, about giving and receiving, about finding meaning in acts that could not be calculated. Jean-Paul sat quietly, his eyes fixed on the city outside, but his mind was alive with questions. He wondered if it was too late to change, if he could still learn to live with warmth instead of coldness. He realized that the bus ride was not only carrying him through Lyon. It was carrying him through his own memories, his own regrets, and his own hopes. The homeless man and his dog had shown him something that no book of accounts could teach. That generosity was possible even in the hardest of lives, and that true wealth was found in kindness. Jean-Paul felt that a door had opened inside him, a door he had kept closed for too long. The bus moved on, but Jean-Paul carried the image with him. He understood that the lesson was simple yet powerful. Generosity could exist even in poverty, and it was a reminder that his own life did not have to remain cold. He began to doubt the way he had lived, and in that doubt he found the first spark of change. The seat by the window had given him a view not only of the city but of himself, and he realized that sometimes the smallest scenes could awaken the deepest truths. Chapter 3. Clara's View. Clara Weber sat quietly by the window of the bus, her sketchbook resting on her lap though she had not yet opened it. She was 32 years old, a German artist who had come to Lyon in search of new inspiration. For months she had felt restless, as if her creativity had grown tired. She had visited galleries, studied paintings, and walked through museums, but none of it had given her the spark she needed. She believed that art should be alive, that it should speak to the heart, yet she had begun to doubt her own vision. As the bus moved slowly through the streets, she looked outside with the hope that something unexpected might catch her eye. Her gaze fell upon an old wall near a narrow street. The wall was cracked and worn, its surface marked by years of weather and neglect. Yet it was not empty. It was covered with graffiti, layers of color and shapes painted by unknown hands. Some of the marks were rough, others more careful, but together they created a strange harmony. Clara leaned closer to the window, her eyes tracing the lines and colors. She saw not destruction but creation, not vandalism but expression. The wall spoke to her in a way the galleries had not. It carried the voices of people who had wanted to leave a mark, to say something about themselves, even if only in paint. Clara felt her heart stir. She realized that inspiration did not always come from polished works displayed in perfect frames. It could come from simple things, from places where life left its traces. The graffiti was raw, imperfect, but it was alive. It showed courage, the courage to create without permission, without fear of judgment. Clara understood that art was not only about beauty. It was about truth, about showing what was inside, even if the world did not always approve. She thought about her own work, about the times she had hesitated, afraid that her paintings were not good enough. The wall reminded her that art was not about perfection. It was about honesty. She imagined the people who had painted the wall. Perhaps they were young, searching for identity, or perhaps they were older, trying to leave a message before it was too late. Each color, each line carried a story, and together they formed a collective voice. Clara felt connected to them, even though she did not know their names. She realized that she too was searching for a voice, for a way to speak through her art. The wall gave her courage, reminding her that inspiration was everywhere, waiting to be seen. She did not need to chase it in galleries or museums. She needed to open her eyes to the world around her. The bus moved on, but Clara carried the image with her. She opened her sketchbook and began to draw, her hand moving quickly, capturing the shapes and colors she had seen. She felt alive again, her doubt fading as her creativity returned. The wall had given her a gift, a reminder that art was not distant or unreachable. It was present in the streets, in the walls, in the lives of ordinary people. Clara understood that her journey was not about finding inspiration in grand places. It was about learning to see the beauty in simple things. The seat by the window had shown her that truth, and she knew it would stay with her as she continued her path as an artist. Clara noticed an old wall covered with graffiti and saw art in it. She realized that inspiration came from simple things, not only from galleries. The lesson was clear, and it gave her strength to trust her vision and to continue creating with honesty. Chapter 4. Marcos's View. Marcos Silva sat near the back of the bus, his body leaning slightly against the window as the city passed by. He was 24 years old, a student from Portugal who had come to Lyon to study economics. His family had encouraged him to choose this path, believing it would give him stability and respect, but Marcos often felt uncertain. He carried books in his bag, filled with theories and numbers, yet his heart was restless. He wondered if he was truly living his own life or simply following the expectations of others. The bus ride gave him time to think, and he often looked out of the window searching for answers he could not find in lectures or textbooks. As the bus turned onto a quieter street, Marcos noticed a group of teenagers playing football on an empty lot. The ground was uneven, the goalposts were nothing more than jackets placed on the dirt, and the ball was worn from use. Yet the players moved with energy and joy, their laughter rising above the noise of the city. They chased the ball with determination, not for trophies or recognition, but for the simple pleasure of the game. Marcos watched them closely, his eyes following their movements, and he felt something stir inside him. He realized that happiness was not always about success or achievement. It was about moments of freedom, about living fully in the present without fear of failure. He thought about his own life, about the pressure he carried to succeed, to prove himself through grades and future career plans. He remembered nights spent studying until exhaustion, mornings filled with anxiety about exams, and the constant voice in his head telling him that he must not fail. Watching the teenagers, he understood that they were free from such burdens, at least in that moment. Their joy came from play, from friendship, from the simple act of running together. Marcos felt a quiet envy, but also a sense of hope. He realized that he too could choose to live with more freedom, to find happiness in small moments instead of waiting for distant achievements. The bus continued forward, but Marcos's thoughts stayed with the scene. He imagined himself as a boy again, playing football with friends in his hometown, laughing without worry about the future. He remembered the feeling of running across the field, the wind against his face, the joy of scoring a goal even if no one was keeping count. Those memories reminded him that life had once been simpler, and that he had allowed responsibility to take away that simplicity. He understood now that responsibility was important, but it should not erase joy. The teenagers had shown him that freedom could exist even in ordinary places, and that happiness was not something to be earned but something to be lived. Marcos sat quietly, his mind full of reflection. He realized that his uncertainty about the future was not a weakness but a chance to choose differently. He did not have to measure his worth only by success or recognition. He could measure it by the way he lived, by the moments of freedom he allowed himself, by the joy he shared with others. The seat by the window had given him a lesson, one that no classroom could teach. Happiness was not always about success. It was about freedom, about living with courage and honesty, about finding meaning in the present. Marcos carried this truth with him as the bus moved on, knowing that it would guide him in the choices he had yet to make. Marcos watched teenagers playing football on an empty lot. He understood that happiness was not always about success but about moments of freedom. The lesson stayed with him, reminding him that life was not only about the future but also about the present, and that true joy could be found in the simplest of places. Chapter 5. Louise's View. Louise Benoit sat near the front of the bus, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her gaze fixed on the window beside her. At 67 years old, she carried herself with quiet dignity, though her heart often felt heavy. Since the death of her husband, she had lived alone, her days filled with silence and small routines that gave her comfort but not joy. She had grown used to the emptiness, yet she still searched for meaning, for something that could remind her that life was not finished even when love seemed gone. The bus ride was part of her daily rhythm, a way to feel connected to the city, to watch the world move even when her own life felt still. As the bus rolled through the streets of Lyon, Louise's eyes caught sight of a young couple walking hand in hand along the sidewalk. They moved with ease, their steps light, their faces glowing with quiet happiness. The man leaned slightly toward the woman, and she smiled as if the world around them had disappeared. Louise felt a sharp ache in her chest, a reminder of the days when she too had walked with her husband, sharing simple gestures that carried deep meaning. The sight of the couple brought back memories of evenings spent strolling by the river, of laughter shared over small things, of the comfort of a hand held tightly in moments of uncertainty. The pain of loss rose inside her, but it was not only sorrow. It was also recognition. She understood that love did not vanish with death. It stayed in memory, alive in the heart, shaping the way she saw the world. Watching the couple, she realized that her grief was also proof of the depth of her love. The memories she carried were not chains but gifts, reminders that she had lived fully, that she had known what it meant to be cherished. The couple's happiness did not make her bitter. Instead, it reminded her that love continued in different forms, even when the person was gone. Louise thought about the years since her husband's passing. At first, she had felt broken, as if her life had ended with his. She had withdrawn, afraid to face the world, afraid to see others living what she had lost. But slowly she had learned that memory could give strength. She had begun to find comfort in small acts, in helping neighbors, in sharing stories with children, in keeping alive the kindness her husband had once shown her. The sight of the young couple confirmed what she had already begun to understand, that love was not only about presence. It was about legacy, about the way it shaped the soul and gave courage to continue. The bus moved forward, but Louise's thoughts stayed with the couple. She felt both sadness and peace, both longing and gratitude. She realized that her seat by the window had given her more than a view of the city. It had given her a mirror, showing her that her pain was also her strength. She could live with loss because she carried love inside her, and that love could guide her even in loneliness. Louise understood that her journey was not about forgetting but about remembering with courage. The couple's joined hands reminded her that love was eternal, and that even in absence it remained a source of life. Louise saw a young couple holding hands. She felt the pain of loss but also understood that love stayed in memory and gave strength to live. The lesson was clear, and it gave her hope that her days ahead could still carry meaning, shaped not by sorrow alone but by the quiet power of love that never truly ends. Chapter 6. Crossing Paths. The bus continued its steady journey through the streets of Lyon, carrying its passengers forward as the morning light grew stronger. Inside, the atmosphere was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the engine and the occasional sound of footsteps as people entered or left. Yet for 4 passengers seated by the windows, the silence was not empty. Each of them had already experienced something that touched their hearts. Jean-Paul had seen generosity in poverty. Clara had discovered art in unexpected places. Marcos had remembered freedom in simple play, and Louise had felt the power of love that lived on in memory. Their thoughts were heavy, but slowly they began to notice one another. Jean-Paul lifted his eyes from the window and saw Clara sketching quickly in her notebook. He recognized the intensity in her movements, the way she tried to capture something before it disappeared. He felt a quiet respect for her, realizing that she was searching for meaning just as he was. Clara, in turn, noticed Jean-Paul's tired posture and the way his gaze seemed both distant and thoughtful. She understood that he was not only a man of routine but also someone who carried questions inside him. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and though no words were spoken, there was recognition. Each saw in the other a reflection of change, a silent struggle to find something new. Marcos, seated further back, observed both of them. He noticed Jean-Paul's seriousness and Clara's restless energy, and he felt connected to them even though they were strangers. He understood that they too were searching, just as he was searching for clarity in his own life. When Clara's eyes moved toward him, he felt a spark of understanding. She saw his youth, his uncertainty, and she recognized the same questions she had once carried. Marcos lowered his gaze, but inside he felt less alone. He realized that doubt was not only his burden. It was something shared, something that connected him to others. Louise, near the front, watched them all with quiet attention. She saw Jean-Paul's fatigue, Clara's passion, and Marcos's hesitation, and she felt a deep sense of compassion. She understood that each of them was living an inner change, just as she was living her own. Her loneliness had often made her feel separate from the world, but in that moment she felt part of something larger. She realized that the bus was not only carrying passengers. It was carrying stories, each unfolding silently, each teaching lessons. When her eyes met Jean-Paul's, she saw kindness waiting to be awakened. When she looked at Clara, she saw creativity struggling to breathe. When she noticed Marcos, she saw youth searching for direction. And she knew that her own journey of memory and love was not isolated. It was connected to theirs. The bus became more than a vehicle. It became a place where paths crossed, where strangers shared silent recognition. None of them spoke, yet their eyes carried messages. They understood that each was living an inner change, that each was touched by something seen through the window. The connection was quiet but powerful. It reminded them that transformation was not only personal. It was shared, and it grew stronger when they recognized it in others. The seat by the window had given them views of the world, but now it gave them views of each other. And in that crossing of paths, they felt less alone, more human, and more ready to continue their journeys. The passengers began to notice each other. Their eyes met, and they understood that each was living an inner change. The lesson was clear. Even strangers could share silent bonds, and sometimes the greatest strength came from knowing that others were walking the same road of discovery. Chapter 7. Stop of Choice. The bus slowed down as it reached a quiet stop near the edge of the city. The sound of the brakes filled the silence, and the doors opened with a soft hiss. For most passengers, it was just another stop on an ordinary morning, but for 4 people seated by the windows it felt different. Jean-Paul, Clara, Marcos, and Louise had each seen something through the glass that had touched their hearts. They had carried those images inside them, and now the bus seemed to ask them for a decision. It was not only about leaving the bus. It was about choosing how to continue their lives. Jean-Paul sat with his hands resting on his knees, his mind heavy with the memory of the homeless man who had shared bread with his dog. He thought about his own cold way of living, about the years he had spent protecting himself with numbers and rules. He realized that he could step off the bus and return to the same routine, the same safe but empty existence. Or he could accept the lesson he had seen, the truth that generosity was possible even in poverty, and allow it to change him. The stop felt like a mirror, showing him both paths. He understood that the choice was his, and that it would shape the rest of his days. Clara held her sketchbook tightly, her eyes still alive with the image of the graffiti wall. She had felt inspiration return to her, reminding her that art was not only in galleries but in the streets, in the voices of ordinary people. She thought about leaving the bus and returning to her doubts, to the fear that her work was not good enough. But she also thought about stepping into a new path, one where she trusted her vision and created with honesty. The stop gave her a moment of clarity. She realized that inspiration was not something to chase far away. It was already around her, waiting to be seen. The choice was whether she would believe in it and in herself. Marcos leaned against the window, his thoughts filled with the laughter of the teenagers playing football. He remembered his own youth, the freedom he had once felt, and the way responsibility had taken it from him. He thought about leaving the bus and continuing to live with uncertainty, measuring his worth only by success and recognition. But he also thought about choosing differently, about allowing himself to find joy in small moments, about living with courage instead of fear. The stop felt like a turning point, a chance to decide whether he would remain trapped in doubt or step into a life shaped by freedom. He understood that happiness was not waiting in the future. It was waiting in the present, if he chose to see it. Louise sat quietly, her eyes soft with memory. She had seen the young couple holding hands, and it had reminded her of the love she had lost, but also of the love that still lived in her heart. She thought about leaving the bus and continuing her days in silence, carrying loneliness as she always had. But she also thought about choosing to live with strength, to use her memories as a source of courage, to share kindness with others instead of hiding from the world. The stop gave her a moment of peace. She realized that her journey was not about forgetting but about remembering with hope. The choice was whether she would remain in sorrow or step into a life shaped by love that never ended. The bus waited, its doors open, as if inviting each passenger to decide. For Jean-Paul, Clara, Marcos, and Louise, the stop was more than a pause in the journey. It was a test, a moment where they had to choose between returning to the old life or accepting new thoughts and change. None of them spoke, but each felt the weight of the decision. The seat by the window had shown them lessons, and now the stop asked them to act. The choice was simple yet profound. It was the choice between fear and courage, between doubt and trust, between silence and life. The bus could carry them forward, but only they could decide how to continue their path. The bus stopped. Each had a choice: to leave and return to the old life or to accept new thoughts and change. The moment was quiet, but it carried the power of transformation, reminding them that sometimes the smallest stops can open the way to the greatest journeys. Chapter 8. A New Path. The bus came to its final stop, and the doors opened with a quiet hiss. The morning had carried each passenger through streets filled with ordinary scenes, yet those scenes had touched their hearts in extraordinary ways. One by one, they rose from their seats by the window, stepping into the world with new thoughts and new strength. The ride had been short, but the lessons they carried would last far longer. Jean-Paul Durand walked out first, his steps slower but lighter than before. He had spent years living in routine, protecting himself with numbers and rules, but the image of the homeless man sharing bread with his dog had stayed with him. He realized that kindness was not measured by wealth but by the willingness to give. As he moved through the streets of Lyon, he felt a quiet determination to change. He wanted to be gentler with others, to open his heart instead of hiding behind cold discipline. For the first time in years, he believed that his life could hold warmth, and he carried that belief with him like a promise. Clara Weber followed, her sketchbook pressed against her chest. She had seen inspiration in the graffiti wall, and it had reminded her that art was not only in galleries but in the voices of ordinary people. She felt alive again, her doubts fading as her creativity returned. She decided to begin a new project, one that would capture the raw beauty of the streets, the honesty of simple marks left by unknown hands. She understood that her work did not need perfection. It needed truth. As she walked away from the bus, she felt ready to trust her vision, to create with courage, and to share her art with the world. Marcos Silva stepped out next, his eyes bright with reflection. He had watched teenagers playing football, and their laughter had reminded him that happiness was not always about success but about freedom. He realized that he had allowed responsibility and fear to take away his joy, but he no longer wanted to live that way. He chose a path that would bring him moments of happiness, even if it meant changing direction. He understood that his worth was not measured only by achievements but by the way he lived each day. As he walked into the city, he felt lighter, ready to embrace life with more courage and less doubt. Finally, Louise Benoit left the bus, her steps careful but steady. She had seen the young couple holding hands, and it had reminded her of the love she had lost but also of the love that still lived in her memory. She realized that her grief was not only sorrow but also strength, a reminder that she had known what it meant to be cherished. She decided to use that strength to help others, to share kindness and comfort with those who felt alone. Her loneliness no longer felt like an end. It felt like a beginning, a chance to live with hope and to give meaning to her days. The bus stood empty, but the lessons remained. Each passenger had chosen a new path, shaped not by fear but by courage, not by doubt but by trust. The seat by the window had given them views of the world, but more importantly, it had given them views of themselves. They understood now that life was full of lessons, waiting to be seen in ordinary moments. The ride had ended, but their journeys had just begun. Moral: sometimes a simple seat by the window opens our eyes to the lessons of life. We see the world, but the most important thing is that we begin to see ourselves. Thank you for your attention. If you like the story, please like and subscribe. It motivates us to make new videos and helps us promote the channel. Thank you.